Hey, everybody. Welcome to Old Testament Conundrums. I'm excited about doing episode 2. And this is actually take 2. I tried to do this earlier, and I left my microphone on mute for the first 15 minutes. And then I tried to unmute and continue the broadcast, and it wasn't working well. So I just decided to delete the first one and try again, but that's okay. Here we are for take 2 of this broadcast. I just want to say thank you guys so much for just the kind words and even the feedback from our very first episode. Some of you guys have shared the broadcast, and hey, I'm very thankful for that. We want to try to spread the news about Old Testament conundrums. I think it would be helpful and interesting to a lot of Christians because let's face it, there's a lot of things in the Old Testament we kind of scratch our head about, and we're really curious. And you guys have given me a lot of information and a lot of ideas coming up. So I'm super excited about everything. I see the LOL. So you must have caught the first episode. It was kind of funny. So I'm going to try to do this again. We have been doing a series on Messianic prophecies, and the first episode we talked about, were the Messianic prophecies fabricated? And so what I did is I first looked at the New Testament perspective. What does the New Testament show us? How did they read the Old Testament? Did they believe that it was intrinsically Messianic? And without a doubt, we saw the authors and we saw the characters in the New Testament very much point back to the Old Testament passages and say, Jesus fulfilled this, Jesus fulfilled that. Matter of fact, it was the apologetic of the early Christian church. And so if they were wrong, we got a problem with the New Testament as well. So we need to make sure that we have this right. Now, of course, you guys know that I think the New Testament has it right. And I think they're not committing what we would call eisegesis, like reading back into the Old Testament. I think they were performing true exegesis, not only in a historical sense, but in an exegetical sense, a literary sense. And so we looked at that. We looked at the New Testament perspective. We looked at the historical evidence. We looked at where traditional Judaism and what they thought about the Old Testament, how they read some of the passages. And we saw that this was not a Christian idea. This wasn't some type of Christian commentary on the Old Testament. No, the Jews also talked about a messianic figure and a messianic kingdom. And hey, if you missed that, I did include that episode in the description so you could go back and watch that. And then we talked a little bit more. We advanced the thought a little bit more with the text critical and canonical evidence. That might be really interesting to you. But we see from the historical evidence, the New Testament, even the text critical and canonical evidence, the evidence pushes towards a messianic understanding of the Old Testament. But I think in order to really prove that case, we're going to have to take it a step further. We can't just lean on how do the New Testament writers interpret it or the historical evidence. We need to be able to make the case from the Old Testament itself. And I'm going to share my notes with you, or my screen with you, and you're going to see why I think that is important. So let's go ahead and share the screen. And here's a quote that I want to share with you from Snodgrass. He said this: "The early church applied such texts to Jesus because their conviction about his identity. The conviction about his identity did not derive from the Old Testament. They found Jesus and they saw how the scriptures fit him." Snodgrass went on to say that it would be better to view Jesus as the climax rather than the fulfillment of Scripture. Now, furthermore, not only that, but there's several scholars that also have the persuasion that there are no clear messianic ideas in Israel until the post-exilic period, or even until the 2nd century BC. And so some would say Christians read into it. Yeah, the Jews, traditional Judaism, maybe for a time, but there really wasn't any messianic idea prior to 2nd century BC. So what that would do is pretty much take our historical evidence, our New Testament perspective, and just kind of saying, categorically denying all of that. However, if somebody has that conclusion, these conclusions presuppose that the Hebrew Bible doesn't explicitly or implicitly proclaim the coming of a messianic figure. And so they would actually ignore the text itself. They would claim that the text doesn't actually teach this. One of the things that they go to often when they're trying to prove their case is they try to go to the term Messiah or Mashiach itself, and they will give some type of argumentation like this: the Hebrew Bible commonly and accurately translates Messiah, or the word Messiah, anointed or to anoint. This word Messiah or Mashiach appears 39 times in the Hebrew Bible, generally with another noun such as the anointed priest. Here's a couple of ways that the term Messiah is used. In Isaiah 21:5, it's used for rubbing oil on a shield. So the shield was Mashiach, it was anointed. Okay, you have the smearing of paint on a wall, Jeremiah 29, verse 14. The verb is also used of smearing oil or anointing objects used in worship, such as the altar in Genesis 31:13. You have the anointing of the tent of meetings, Exodus 30:26, and the tabernacle and all that's in it, Exodus 40, verses 9 through 11. These texts indicate that the purpose of this anointing was to consecrate or set apart these items for the worship of God. This word also has a technical meaning, commonly translated as the Messiah or the Mashiach, like a definite article in front of it. Now, with regard to the technical use of the word Messiah or the anointed one, personally, now I'm going to make a distinction between some of the people I quoted and scholars I quoted. I believe that this term does actually refer to an eschatological deliverer, but honestly, it is somewhat rare in the Old Testament. Most will acknowledge that there are a few passages, and I want to talk about that, the technical use of the Messiah. You have Daniel 9:25. Jewish interpreters as well as Christian interpreters would look back at Daniel 9, and they would both conclude that this is talking about the messianic figure. You have phrases like, until the anointed or the Messiah, the prince, will come. You have the phrase, the Messiah will be cut off. Now, the Jews didn't have a space for that. They didn't understand what it meant for the anointed one to be cut off. Christians would have obviously a deeper and a different understanding of that, understanding Christ who would come and be crucified. But most would agree that this was a messianic, or understood to be a messianic passage, used in the technical sense. You have Psalm 2, verse 2. It says, the Lord and his anointed one, this is the phrase, but in Psalm 2, and really the whole passage, really, this is the psalm that talks about, why does the heathen rage and imagine a vain thing? Why do they're trying to cast off their cords from the Lord and his anointed? But the passage goes on to say that God is sovereign and he's going to bring out his divine redemptive plan. And so instead of turning against the Son, we should kiss the Son. We should honor him. This is another psalm that has been clearly understood as messianic, at least from a Christian and Jewish perspective. So again, terms that are used for the Messiah in a very technical way. But when it comes to this term through the Old Testament, it really isn't used that often for what we think of as the messianic figure. Some say there's 9 occasions, but that is debated. Now, for our time, we're looking at the Torah. We're looking at a passage in Genesis today. The question I want to raise is, how many times in the Torah is the term Messiah referring to this messianic figure? That's a great question. It may surprise you. 0 times. There is no time in the first 5 books of the Old Testament is the word Mashiach referencing this messianic figure. Well, I mean, if we're making the case, excuse me, that the Old Testament should be read messianically, and the foundation of the Old Testament, the Torah, is all about developing this meta-narrative, but the term Messiah is not even used in its technical sense for this messianic figure, that seems a little bit, well, sketch. Now, while the vocabulary normally associated with the concept of the Messiah is absent from Genesis and the Torah, the idea of a future unique king who will bring God's blessing to other people emerges from the plot of the entire book. So what I want to do is I want to start with the first mentioning of this Messianic figure. Now, we need to understand that the way that the Old Testament does this, it doesn't come out of the gate and say, hey, there's a Messiah coming and he's going to die on the cross and he's going to resurrect and he's going to save people from their sins. No, the way the Messianic figure is developed through the narrative, it begins with hints, indications, things that would build expectation. And before we know it, as the Torah and as the Old Testament is developing this Messianic figure, we begin to get more details of this coming king, this coming person. But when it starts off, it does start off very simple. And this is the first mention or allusion or hint of this Messianic figure. This is Genesis 3:15. Now, this text historically has been called the Proto-Evangelium, the first gospel. This was designated Proto-Evangelium by Irenaeus, an early church father who clearly taught this was the first good announcement of the good news of a coming king, or a coming Messiah who would fix all that is broken in our world. Now, Gerald Sigel railed and set on this idea and said, there is absolutely no proof to assume that this verse, Genesis 3:15, is messianic. Finding a reference to Jesus here is to be exegetically untenable. Now, I want to really raise the question, is he right? Well, I don't think he is. And I would like to challenge this conclusion. But I want to do that by actually presenting to you 4 views of Genesis 3:15. Now, what this will do is it will help us see the landscape of interpretation. It would also save us from developing kind of a straw man to set up and say, hey, look, this is what this passage is saying, and kind of knock down all the other arguments. It'll help us present a steel man. But then as we present and we show the messianic reading of the text, I think you'll see that it is exegetical, it's syntactical, and also it follows the literary flow of Genesis as well. So we're going to look at this. And the first thing that I want you to see, the first view of Genesis 3:15 is what we would call the naturalistic view. The interpretation, or this interpretation rather, sees the serpent as just a part of the animal kingdom. The serpent's seed would just be more snakes. The seed of the woman would be collective humanity. Now, in this view, the one who championed this view was Claus Westermann, and he said that the curse is merely is etiology. It identifies why snakes slither and why snakes and humanity seem to be in perpetual conflict. The text describes why humans hate snakes and want to kill them. Okay, that's the basic idea. Now, so Weatherman just says, just look at the text real naturally. Don't try to, allegorize it, make it symbolize it, make it have some type of messianic tone. Just take it at face value. Now, Westermann gives 2 arguments to support the naturalistic interpretation. First, he maintains that the word for seed or offspring, the word zerah, must be understood collectively. Hence, the seed of the woman is speaking of a line of the woman's descendants, and therefore cannot refer to individuals, like an individual messianic descent. It's impossible in his mind, exegetically. And secondly, according to Westermann, the passage is a pronouncement of judgment, and so according to form criticism, it would not contain a promise of victory. And hope is not in the midst of judgment here, okay? And so that's his 2 major conclusions. Now, we're going to give some objections, but I'm just trying to give you the idea. So just very natural. The serpent is a serpent. His offsprings are snakes. This is the woman. It's talking about collective humanity. Just a very natural way of looking at it. So that's that view. And I meant to put that on your screen so you could take notes. That was my bad. So you could see his 2 arguments. The second thing is the symbolic view. Okay. Now, the proponent of this view, at least one of the main proponents, is John H. Walton, and he states this. He says, this verse is depicting a continual, unresolved conflict between humans and the representatives of evil. So basically, this just ongoing hostility between the seed of the serpent, which is seen as the symbol of evil, and the seed of the woman, which is the symbol of good. And there's just ongoing conflict that just goes on and on and on with no definite ending to it. Now, Walton supports his conclusion by also using first, number one, the collective idea of the word zera, seed, arguing that a particular individual redeemer is not in view in this verse. So similar to Westerman's argument. And number two, second, he maintains that the verb translated strike should be read comparably as equal blows. Thus, both the woman's seed and the serpent's seed strike each other, showing that there is no sense of victory of the women's seed. Moreover, the snake's described would have been understood as a poisonous, deadly one. So it doesn't tell us if the women's seed wins or the serpent seed wins. It just tells us there's hostility. Looks like there's a deadly blow to both of them. So no victory in sight. And he's just saying this is symbolic. So symbolic, not messianic. So that is one view that is propounded as well. So, and here's and let me just point out that John Calvin, pastor theologian, he said, he actually agrees with this viewpoint. He says, I interpret this simply to mean that there should always be the hostile strife between the human race and serpents, which is now apparent, for by a secret feeling of nature, man abhors them. So that was his view. A third view is sensus plenior, and which this word just simply means like a fuller sense or a fuller meaning. And it's basically a sub-view of the first two views. This interpretation adopts the naturalistic as well as the symbolic view described above. Now, for example, and here's a proponent of this view, Jordan Wenham writes, on the face of it, the saying looks like a mere ideology. It is an explanation of why men try to kill snakes and why snakes try to bite men. Additionally, he maintained that the author of Genesis only wanted to describe lifelong mutual hostility between mankind and the serpent race. Beyond the human's intent, Wenham suggests that there may be a possibility of a secondary messianic understanding added to these verses based on later revelation, hence a sensus plenior, as he had called it. Nevertheless, he also warned that it would be wrong to suggest that this was the narrator's own understanding. So basically, when Moses wrote this, he looked at this very naturally. He didn't think anything of a Messiah. That wasn't even in his mind, okay? He thought, symbol of good and evil, maybe talking about man and snakes, but certainly not messianic. Messianic understanding came much later. So that's the sensus plenior understanding. Now, I think there, to a level, I do agree with, as the revelation of God continued, there's a fuller sense being developed, no doubt. But I also think this actually runs against what the New Testament says, because Jesus says, Moses wrote of me and testified of me, for he wrote of me, which indicates that Moses had an understanding that when he was writing, at least in part, he was writing of the Messiah. We dealt with last time in 1 Peter that when the prophets were writing about these things, they were searching what person and time that this would take place. So they knew of the Messianic figure, and they were trying to figure out when this Messianic figure would come. So it wasn't unbeknownst to them. But this sensus plenior would actually have this type of leaning. So basically, there's two meanings of this text. One, the original audience would have thought of. And then secondly, a post-Christ readership or hearer, they would have read it more messianically, whereas the Old Testament people reading it would have read it more naturally or symbolically. So that's that view. So we have the naturalistic view, the symbolic view, the sensus plenior view, and then finally, this is the last major view, is the Messianic view. Now, this view, this interpretation sees the serpent as Satan, or empowered by Satan, and his seed as anyone who follows his likeness. I want to pause there and say, I think we're going to see this. We're not going to look into this in detail, but as we go into even the next chapter, Genesis chapter 4, when Cain murdered and he sinned against the Lord, he is cursed, and you're going to actually hear language that sounds similar to the curse of the serpent. And what seems to be indicated through Genesis 4 is that Cain is actually of the serpent seed. And anybody that follows suit, you think about in John chapter 8, where Jesus says to the Pharisees, you're of your father, the devil. You're of the serpent seed. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he abode not in the truth. And he says, hey, you're of him. You're of his seed. You're following him. So it seems to be the serpent would be Satan. His seed is anyone who follows his likeness. And the seed of the woman being a specific offspring, the Messiah. So not collective, but a specific offspring, the Messiah. Now, I want to argue that the Messianic view is exegetically seen, syntactically seen, and also literarily seen. It's more sustainable, and it is the best explanation of what is said of Genesis 3:15. So we need to examine that. Now, I'm a little bit surprised that even the Net Bible, which I love the Net Bible, and there's a note in it that basically says that if you read Genesis 3:15 messianically, you're reading it allegorically. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's actually more of a literal, careful reading of the text, and I hope to display that to you. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to do it by arguments and counter arguments. So in some of the other views, they said that the word seed is not, they would say that the word seed is limited to a collective sense. So it's not talking about an individual offspring, but it only can be talking about this collective sense. Now, I want to actually make the comment in the statement that the word seed is not limited to the collective sense. Both the naturalistic and symbolic view makes a lexical argument that this seed is limited to a collective sense, but this is simply incorrect. The word can also be used with an individual meaning as well. For example, the word seed is used of an individual in the very next chapter, Genesis 4:25, when Eve identified Seth as a particular seed, translated child, or it can be translated child, given in the place of Abel. Now, let me read the verse to you. Genesis 4:25, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me, catch this, another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Now, who is the other offspring? It's Seth. So in context, the offspring is clearly seen as an individual, not used in the collective sense. Now, Genesis 3:15 also does a similar thing, and I want you to notice this. And I'm being a bit technical, but this is important. Zerah never occurs in the plural form in the Old Testament. In context, when the seed / offspring should be translated as plural, then plural nouns or pronouns will accompany it. The same is true of a singular interpretation as well. Context always determines its use, just like in Genesis 4 that we just showed. In Genesis 3:15, Moses uses singular nouns and pronouns. But not only that, Moses emphasizes the he with an independent pronoun, kind of like a little bit of an extra. This is just a supplied pronoun. It's simply there for emphasis. Now, in Hebrew, the subject of a sentence is connected to either the noun or the verb. Now, my friend Mark Sinners, he wrote an article for City Light called The Messianic Serpent Slayer. And he's a beast when it comes to Hebrew. And I'm so excited about having him on the series that we're going to be doing here as well. And he gave this illustration in the article, and I thought it was helpful. He said the phrase, he will crush, or excuse me, yes, that should be he will crush. I don't know why I said we, but anyways, that should be he in the notes. He will crush. Actually should be translated will crush he, or in the Hebrew, that's how it would be read. Let me restate that because I actually got a little tripped up by my typo here. The he will crush in your translation in the Hebrew would be will crush he. So in other words, it's like one Hebrew word and all of it's jammed together. So the pronoun is embedded within that Hebrew word. However, there's an independent pronoun in Hebrew, which an author can use for emphasis. So now this is actually clearly seen in a translation. Genesis 3:15, this is how it would be translated if you actually showed the pronoun in the translation. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He himself will crush your head, and you yourself will crush his heel. So there's an emphasis here. Moses inserts two independent pronouns to grab our attention and to focus the promise on a single individual. A single offspring from the woman will come and crush the serpent, reverse the curse, restore the broken fellowship between God and man. Now, the syntactical evidence encourages a messianic view of Genesis 3:15. Now, we're going to say more about that, but I want to go to the other objection. Another counter argument is this. Somebody said, well, this is not about redemption or hope or victory. This is about judgment. And one opposition said that this is about judgment. It can't be about redemption. But I want to suggest that the combination of judgment and redemption happens all through the scriptures. Now, I could give many examples, but just think about the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is condemning Israel for their sin, and they're going to be, there's a lot of coming judgment that's coming to them. But almost out of the same breath do we find promises of God's redemption and what he's doing. And there's a lot of messianic promises. In Isaiah chapter 7, there is the sign of this virgin birth of a son. Isaiah 9 talks about, and we're going to talk about this in a couple weeks. Isaiah 9 talks about there's going to be a son that comes, and he's going to dawn upon humanity, and he's going to usher in something that has a kingdom of righteousness and justice. And you go to the end of Isaiah and you see this messianic kingdom that's being developed. I mean, it's beautiful, but it's in the context of judgment. And so I don't think that the first point here, the word seed can only be a collective sense. I think that's wrong. And also I think this idea of judgment and redemption can't be in the same section would also be a wrong assessment as well. Now, I would admit this, that it is in the context of a curse, but I think the way that they read it clearly shows us that they did have messianic hope, and I wish to display that as well. Somebody gave the comment that the serpent, the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman would actually have an equal death blow to each other. So the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, they don't have an upper hand. There is no victory necessarily. But actually, this equal death blow to the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent does not weaken a messianic interpretation. Matter of fact, if you go forward as Revelation progresses, we do believe that the Messiah is going to suffer. We're going to talk about Isaiah 53 in the future. You go to the New Testament. He obviously did die on a cross. So there was a death blow. But what we weren't told was that this Messiah, at least in Genesis 3, is that this redeeming figure that's coming, he is going to be resurrected and he's going to establish a kingdom. And that is going to progress as the meta-narrative goes forward in the Old Testament. But either way, with this even their understanding, it doesn't mess up a messianic interpretation. So that's important to see as well. And the last thing that I want you to notice is that the Genesis narrative as a whole strengthens the messianic interpretation. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the literary evidence of Genesis, we see that actually what is being traced through the book of Genesis is really this particular thought. This Genesis 3:15 is not just an incidental thing that was stated at the beginning, and it's no longer in the narrative. It actually guides the plot line of Genesis, the Torah, and really the rest of the Old Testament. And arguably, it sets the pace for the rest of the Bible. I like how one author put, I don't know if I put this in your notes. Yes, I did. John Sailhammer said this: more is at stake in this brief passage than the reader is at first aware. A program is set forth, a plot is established that will take the author far beyond this or that snake and his seed. And so as you go through the biblical narrative, you're going to come to passages. So let's just trace this out. Now, what I want to do next week is I want to dive deeper into how this is traced out through the Torah. But I want to just give us enough for our understanding right now, because I just proposed to you that Genesis 3:15 makes sense exegetically and syntactically more as a messianic interpretation. But does the text actually show that? Does the context actually show that through the rest of the book? Well, let's just consider Genesis chapter, I'm going to go back to the quote in a minute, but Genesis chapter 4, verse 1. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, Eve recognizes the birth of Cain, that it is significant, and that he might be the promised seed. Cain proves to be the seed of the serpent by killing Abel. This reflects the conflict between the two seeds. Seth carries on the promise of the godly line and the messianic hope. It's interesting that in Genesis 4:1, I'm going to point this out a little bit more clearly next week, but when you read Genesis 4:1, it seems that Eve is saying that she had required a man, and sometimes we have supplied words there, but in the Hebrew, it's just literally, I have acquired a man, the Lord. And it's quite possible that Eve thought that Cain was the promised Messiah coming. Now, he turned out not to be the case. And then Abel was killed. So who's going to continue this line? And in Genesis 4, I believe it's verse 26, it talks about God giving another specific offspring, Seth, who would carry that line. Now, in Genesis chapter 5, is one of the boring parts of Scripture, genealogies. But remember, what is the plot line being established? You do have this seed, so it would make sense to go into genealogies. And in hidden is a crucial text that reveals what people were thinking of post Genesis 3:15. In verse 29, Lamech, hope, is that the birth of his son Noah will be the promise fulfilled. Noah means comfort and it means rest. Lamech says, out of the ground, this is verse 28, out of the ground the Lord has cursed. This one, that's Noah, shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. So it's obvious that Lamech is tying back to the language of Genesis 3, and he's hoping that his son would be the promised one that would bring relief. We see that in the language. Now, Noah wasn't the skull crusher of the serpent, but he was certainly used of God to secure the promise. And this takes us into Genesis 6. What is happening in Genesis 6? Well, we have the flood, and what do we see? We see God protecting the bloodline, protecting the seed in the family, in Noah's family. Then in Genesis chapter 9, we have a promise given to Shem that continues actually messianic implications and continues the seed. We have the curse of Ham, but then you have the blessing of Shem, and also Japheth is included in that too, but particularly Shem. Then you have in Genesis chapter 12, you have the Abrahamic covenant, which is bursting with messianic expectation. Abraham is promised three things: offspring, land, and to be the blessing, and to be blessing to all the nations. Genesis 17 fills out this Abrahamic covenant more, and he says, I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between to me and you and your offspring after you through generations for an everlasting covenant. So now he knows that this is going to continue in his lineage. It's going to continue forth. So again, the promise involves offspring. So the question has to be raised, how could a future seed be a blessing to all nations? Now, we don't know the answer to that, but this is building messianic expectation. This messianic hope is passed then to Isaac, then it's passed to Jacob. And there's occasion where Abraham is given a hint of this messianic hope in Genesis 22. The climax of Abraham's story, it prophesies that the seed of Abraham will rule their enemies. As the story progresses, we are able to assemble more of the puzzle about the identity of the Messiah. And then we get to the end of Genesis 49, verse 10. Now, when Jacob is dying, he calls his sons to himself so that he can bless them. And in doing so, he also prophesied something concerning each son. Judah is told that the scepter, which is you could say a tool, a scepter would be a staff for a king, if you would. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until he, a particular individual, he comes to whom it belongs. Belongs what? The scepter, the kingdom. So this is obviously predicting a messianic king. So as the narrative progresses, there is the seed of the woman that's going to crush the serpent. Now, what we're going to find out later as that's filled out is that this is actually bringing a hope to people that all that's wrong in our world is going to be made right. There's going to be redemption. There's going to be restoration. And even though there's a bunch of mess in the book of Genesis, God keeps his promise. He makes a covenant with Noah. He makes a covenant with Abraham. And we see God keeping his promise through the mess. We see him preserving this line all the way through. And we get to Genesis, and that expectation is continued to be built. So the author of the Torah offers a hint of a coming Redeemer in Genesis 3:15. And then he traces through about the coming of this Redeemer through the rest of the book. And what we see is this future kingly figure emerging. The rest of the Torah will flesh out details about the figure and the nature of his coming. We will see later Old Testament texts that the writers recognize the seed in Genesis 3:15 as clearly pointing to this messianic deliverer. So here's a quote I got from William Vardner. He said this: one could actually describe the individual messianic prophecies as the numerous tips of a rather large iceberg. That huge iceberg is the story that moves progressively through the Hebrew Bible until its consummation in the New Covenant scriptures. And certainly, as you go to the New Covenant and you look, we see that they no doubt read Genesis 3:15 as messianic. So, but I didn't want to start with the New Testament because you just say, oh, they're reading it back. What we're seeing right now is that actually the messianic view could be substantiated exegetically, syntactically, and literarily so far through the book of Genesis. I think you're going to be more convinced as we go through the Torah and as we go through the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim. And I'm looking forward to going through that with my friend Mark Centers as well. But we get to the New Testament. Notice the words here. Romans 16, verse 20. The God of peace will crush Satan under your feet. Now, listen, that is obviously tying back to Genesis 3:15. It's obviously talking about victory in this context. Now, it says under your feet. It's talking about the church here. And you say, wait, I thought it was Christ that was going to crush the serpent. Yes, but the body of Christ is the church. So this is, in a sense, what Christ did. The church is continuing, and ultimately we'll see a consummation of the ultimate defeat of Satan as well. That's what this text is talking about. Revelation 20, verse 2. It says, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, beholding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan. There's another reference in Revelation 12 that references Satan and the devil as the ancient serpent as well. Obviously tying back to the first couple of pages of Genesis and what happened there. So there's no doubt in my mind that the New Testament read it that way. And as we looked at Genesis and we looked at the text, so far, this reading is what I would consider the superior reading of the text. So I would be glad to hear from you and to hear if you had any type of any thoughts or questions here. Let me see if I can go ahead and remove that off. Yes, there we go. Just going to check on, see if there's any questions here from you guys. Yes, you're exactly right. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce slam RN, but when you talk about the Masoretic text changing vowels, I actually pointed that out in my last video when we dealt with the text critical and canonical evidence. And we dealt with the Masoretic text versus the Septuagint and the Syriac and the Latin Vulgate, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's a really good point. If anybody missed my first session, I think these two actually build on each other. So I hope that was helpful for you. Does anybody have any questions? I'm going to see if I can take any more thoughts. If you want to drop a comment in the section, a question, I would be glad to hear from you. Also, if you're going through and you see other things that point to Jesus as the Messiah or just the intrinsic Messianic reading of the Old Testament, I would be glad for you to pass that on. I'm learning a ton and I'm enjoying this series. Next week, we're going to be tracing through the rest of the Torah, just looking at the Messianic figure and how he is developed. And then the week after that, my friend Mark Sinners is going to begin tracing the Messianic figure through the Nevi'im. And I'm so very pumped about that. And he is a tremendous student of the Old Testament. So I think you'll profit a lot from that as well. All right. Well, you guys have an awesome night. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Old Testament Conundrums. We'll see you soon.